The Thousand-and-Second Tale of Scheherazade. Before the tale begins, understand this is no ordinary story. It is a journey through impossible worlds, narrated across 1,001 nights. Kings have listened, minds have been unsettled, and reality itself bends within these words. Now, listen closely. As Sinbad's voyage continues beyond the limits of imagination, truth is stranger than fiction, an old saying. Lately, while buried deep in some Oriental studies, I came across a strange and almost forgotten work. It's called the Talmud, a book so obscure, so rarely touched, that even in Europe it is barely known. And in America, hardly anyone has ever even mentioned it, except perhaps a single writer of curious literary collections. Now, I'll admit something. What I found inside those pages genuinely surprised me, because it seems the literary world has been getting one very important detail wrong about Scheherazade. Yes, Scheherazade, the vizier's daughter, from the legendary Arabian Nights, the commonly accepted version of her fate. It may not be complete, not nearly as complete as people believe. The usual ending, as it's been passed down, is only part of a much larger story, and in leaving it there, something important gets lost for those who want every detail. The original Isitsurnaut is where the full account lies buried. But here, I'll give you the essence of what I discovered. Now listen closely. In the familiar telling, there was once a king powerful and consumed by jealousy. He had been betrayed by his queen, or so he believed, and the response was not mercy. It was absolute. He ordered her execution, and from that moment forward, something inside him changed, darkened. He made a vow solemn, unbreakable, sworn by his beard and the prophet himself. Each night, he would marry the most beautiful maiden in his kingdom, and by morning, she would be put to death, night after night. The pattern continued, one bride after another, chosen for beauty, taken into the palace, and never seen again after sunrise. The kingdom lived in fear, silent, waiting, never knowing who would be next. And then Scheherazade entered the story, the vizier's daughter, the one who would step forward and begin the chain of tales that would change everything. But even here, in the traditional telling, the story feels like it stops too soon, as if the real ending was left just out of reach, waiting somewhere beyond what most readers were ever told. For years, he carried out this vow exactly as promised. Not loosely, not occasionally, but with a kind of strict, almost ritual precision, as if obedience itself had become a form of devotion. And oddly enough, this very consistency earned him a reputation, a man of discipline, of principle, even of piety. Then one afternoon, everything shifted. He was interrupted, quite likely in the middle of his prayers, by his grand vizier. And the vizier came with something unusual, not a petition, not a warning, but an idea that belonged to his daughter. Her name was Scheherazade, and her thinking was bold, dangerously so. She had resolved something that most would consider madness. Either she would end the kingdom's slow destruction of its own women, or she would die trying, in the time-honored manner of tragic heroines everywhere. No hesitation, no half measures. So she sends word through her father, the Grand Vizier, that she wishes to marry the king. Now, under normal circumstances, this would already be a shocking request, But here's the twist. The king agrees immediately. In fact, he had already intended to take her as his next bride. He had simply delayed the decision day after day, mostly out of caution toward the vizier himself. But now, the hesitation disappears, and yet he makes one thing absolutely clear. Grand Vizier or no Grand Vizier, he will not bend his vow. Not even slightly, not even for her. And so Scheherazade proceeds. She insists on the marriage. And against even her father's strongest objections, she goes through with it. She marries the king, fully aware of what that means, fully aware of the pattern she is stepping into, and when she does, when she stands there as his bride, it is not ignorance that defines her, it is intention. Her dark, intelligent eyes are open, completely open to exactly what she has chosen to face next. It seems, however, that this highly strategic young woman who had clearly been reading Machiavelli, beyond any reasonable doubt, had a plan forming in her mind. A very clever one. On the night of the wedding, she put it into motion. Through some carefully chosen excuse, its exact wording is lost to time, she arranged for her sister to be placed in a nearby couch, close enough that a conversation could easily pass from one bed to the other, close enough for what she intended. Now, just before dawn, just before that thin moment when night begins to collapse into morning, Scheherazade makes her move. She gently wakes her husband, the king, a man who, despite his grim intentions for the following day, bore her no ill will in that moment. In fact, he slept quite well. A strong conscience, a comfortable body, the usual combination. But she wakes him anyway, not abruptly, not loudly, but with something far more effective. Curiosity. She is in the middle of a story, a tale whispered in a low voice, directed not at him, but at her sister nearby. A story involving, if memory serves, a rat and a black cat. Now the king, half awake, hears this fragment of narrative drifting through the room, and he listens, because something about unfinished stories has a strange power. The night wears on, and before either story or night can conclude, dawn arrives. The problem is simple. Scheherazade cannot finish, not because she refuses, but because morning has arrived, and her execution is scheduled immediately after. A far less pleasant appointment, though admittedly slightly more formal than hanging, and yet something unexpected happens. The king hesitates. Just for a moment. His curiosity surprisingly persistent, even against his strict moral and religious principles, takes control. He decides to postpone the execution just one day, just until the next night, so he can hear how it ends, what becomes of the black cat and the rat. Night arrived once again, and Scheherazade resumed her tale. She not only brought the unfinished business of the black cat and the rat to its conclusion, though, oddly enough, the rat had somehow turned blue, but before she quite realized it, she had already drifted into an entirely new narrative, one that spiraled even further away from reason. This time, it involved a pink horse with green wings, a creature not merely alive, but mechanical, moving with a strange clockwork precision, as if every motion had been engineered rather than born. And it was not simply animated, it was wound with an indigo key. Now, at this point, the king was no longer merely interested. He was deeply absorbed, completely drawn in. And once again, Just as the story reached its most critical moment, just as dawn began to press against the edges of the night, it stopped, incomplete, suspended in midair, and once again, the execution hour arrived too soon. Scheherazade, despite all effort, could not finish. And so, once again, the king postponed the sentence. Just one more day. Then another night followed, and then another, and another after that. Each night, a new tale. Each dawn, an interruption. Each execution delayed, until gradually, imperceptibly, the cycle itself began to dissolve. 1,001 nights passed in this manner, and by the end of it all, the king had either forgotten his vow entirely or quietly set it aside through some formal or informal absolution, or more likely than either, abandoned it outright, along with the final remains of its severity. As for Scheherazade, she prevailed, not through force, not through defiance, but through narrative itself, and in doing so, the kingdom's long-standing tax upon beauty was finally lifted. The cycle was broken, and the story, at last, was allowed to continue beyond fear. The ending we usually hear is, without question, neat, pleasant, and properly arranged. But unfortunately, like many things that are too well arranged, it is not entirely true. And here is where, according to the Isiternot, the record requires correction. As the French proverb wisely puts it, le mieux est l'ennemi du bien. The perfect is the enemy of the good. And in speaking earlier of Scheherazade inheriting the 7 baskets of talk, I should have added something important. She did not merely inherit them. She invested them at compound interest until they grew, not into 7 baskets, but 77. Now, on the 1,002nd night, Scheherazade turned to her sister and said verbatim, as the Isitshornot insists, "My dear sister, now that this little difficulty regarding the bowstring has happily passed, and this rather unpleasant tax on beauty has been repealed, I find myself guilty of a certain omission." At this point, she pauses, not dramatically, not unnecessarily, just enough to draw attention, then continues. "I regret to inform you," and the king, who, I am sorry to say, snores, a habit no gentleman should indulge, "that I failed to give the proper conclusion to Sinbad the sailor." Now here she admits something rather human. She grew tired. On that particular night, she had been sleepy, and in that fatigue, she had shortened the story, a mistake, she says, for which she hopes Allah will forgive her. But even now, she believes it is not too late to correct it. So she proposes something simple. First, a small intervention, a pinch or two, just enough to restore the king to consciousness, and ideally silence the snoring. And so it is done. The king is gently roused. He stirs. He emits a few sounds, first then who, which Scheherazade, being fluent in the emotional language of royalty, interprets as agreement. He is awake enough and quiet enough, perfect conditions for storytelling. And so Scheherazade resumes. She turns once again back into the tale of Sinbad the sailor, at last in my old age. So begins Sinbad himself, as preserved in Scheherazade's telling. At last in my old age, after many peaceful years at home, I found myself once again seized by the desire to travel. And so, without informing a single member of his family, he prepares to leave, quietly, deliberately. He packs up bundles of the most valuable merchandise carefully chosen, precious yet compact enough to carry with ease. Then he hires a porter, and together they descend toward the seashore. There they wait, waiting for any passing ship, any chance vessel that might carry him beyond the borders of his known world, into lands he has never yet seen. Time passes, the sun holds steady above them, the sea remains empty, no sails, no movement, no sign of life. Just the slow rhythm of waves against sand. Eventually, they sit beneath a cluster of trees, still watching the horizon, and still nothing. Hours go by, then something changes. Sinbad begins to notice it first, a sound, faint at first, almost imagined. A strange buzzing, a humming in the distance. The porter hears it too. They pause, they listen harder. And now there is no doubt. It is growing louder, closer, approaching. Then on the edge of the horizon, they see it, a small black speck. Barely visible at first, then steadily expanding, taking shape, becoming something enormous, a vast creature, rising above the sea's surface as it moves. It does not simply swim, it dominates the water. It advances with terrifying speed, cutting through the ocean and sending up massive walls of foam around its body, and behind it, a strange, unnatural glow. A long trail of fire stretches across the sea, illuminating the water in a line that seems to burn its way into the distance. It is not just approaching, it is arriving. As it drew closer, continued Sinbad, we could see it with perfect clarity. Its size alone was overwhelming, longer than three of the tallest trees, and wider than the great hall of audience in the caliph's own palace, a scale so vast it almost defied comparison. Its body was nothing like any ordinary fish. Solid, heavy, rock-like in its presence, and above the waterline, it was in absolute jet black, uniform except for one striking detail, a narrow streak of deep blood red that wrapped entirely around its body, like a deliberate marking or a seal. Beneath the surface, where only glimpses could be caught as it rose and fell with the waves, the belly shimmered with metallic scales. They reflected the light in a pale, misted silver, the color of the moon seen through fog. Then came the back, flat, pale, almost white, and rising from it were six enormous spines, each one stretching upward to nearly half the creature's total length. But what unsettled them most was not its size. It was its absence of anything familiar. No mouth could be seen anywhere. None. And yet, it was not blind. Far from it. Instead of a mouth, it had eyes. Dozens of them, no fewer than 80. Each one protruding outward, like the eyes of a dragonfly, but far more unnatural in scale and placement. They were arranged in two precise rows along its body, one above the other, running parallel to that blood-red band, which now seemed less like decoration and more like a dividing line, almost like an eyebrow drawn across something living and watching. And among those eyes, a few stood out, larger than the rest, heavy, still golden color, like solid metal rather than living tissue. And as Sinbad and the porter stared at the approaching creature, it became increasingly clear. This was not simply something from the sea. It was something the sea seemed to be carrying unwillingly. Although this beast, Sinbad continued, came toward us with incredible speed, I am convinced it was moved by necromancy of some kind, for it bore no resemblance to anything known in nature. It had no fins like a fish, no webbed feet like a duck, No wings like those strange drifting shell creatures that move like vessels across the sea. Nor did it writhe forward like an eel. It simply advanced. Its head and tail were shaped almost identically, so much so that it was difficult to distinguish one from the other. And yet, near what we eventually assumed to be the rear, there were two small openings, nostrils. Through them, the creature expelled its breath in violent bursts, thick, forceful jets accompanied by a shrieking, unpleasant sound that cut through the air. Our fear was already great, but it did not end there. Because as the thing drew even closer, we saw something even more astonishing. Upon its back, there were living beings, dozens of them. They were roughly human in size and shape, and at first glance, they might have been mistaken for men, but something was wrong. They wore no clothing. Instead, they were covered in a strange, tight-fitting material, something like fabric, yet so close to the skin it seemed less like clothing and more like a second, unnatural layer imposed upon them. It left them stiff, awkward, visibly uncomfortable in every movement. Then there were the objects on their heads, square structures, heavy looking, firmly fixed in place. At first, Sinbad thought they might be turbans, but no, they were too solid, too rigid, too burdensome. He concluded instead that they were contrivances designed to keep the head steady, pinned in place by weight alone. Around their necks were dark bands, black collars, resembling those placed upon dogs, only wider and far more restrictive. They seemed to prevent any independent movement of the head. In fact, any attempt to look in a different direction forced the entire body to turn with it. And so these strange beings were effectively condemned to a single, unbroken gaze, downward, fixed, perpetually observing only what lay directly beneath them, a posture so constrained, so unnatural, that it reduced their entire existence to a single, inescapable view, their own noses. When the monster had nearly reached the shore where we stood, Sinbad went on. It suddenly thrust out one of its eyes to an extraordinary degree, and then it erupted. A violent flash of fire burst outward, followed by a thick cloud of smoke, and a sound so immense it could only be compared to thunder striking the earth itself. The air shook. The ground seemed to answer it, and as the smoke slowly cleared, something even stranger became visible. One of the human-like figures on its back had stepped forward. He stood near the creature's head, holding a long, narrow instrument, something like a trumpet. He raised it to his mouth, and from it came a voice. Loud, harsh, unpleasant. At first, Sinbad could almost believe it was speech. Almost. But there was something distorted about it. Something wrong in the delivery, as though language itself had been forced through an unnatural passage. It came entirely through the nose. We were stunned, completely at a loss. No one knew how to respond. The porter, meanwhile, was nearly unconscious from terror. Still, I turned to him and demanded answers. What was this creature? What did it want? And who were these beings swarming across its back? The porter, trembling violently, managed to speak. He claimed he had heard of such a sea beast before. A demon, a cruel construct of evil forces, a being said to be formed from sulfur within its bowels and fire in its blood. Created, he said, by malicious genii, designed for the sole purpose of bringing suffering to mankind and those creatures upon its back. Vermin, he said, like fleas or parasites found on cats and dogs. only larger and far more aggressive. But he insisted they served a purpose because their constant biting, their torment, their relentless irritation was what drove the beast into rage. And that rage, in turn, forced it into motion, roaring, destroying, carrying out the intentions of its unseen masters, a cycle of suffering, engineered to keep the monster active and the world beneath it in fear. This account, Sinbad continued, was enough to send me running, and I did not hesitate. Without a second thought, without even the smallest glance backward, I fled, straight toward the hills, at full speed. Behind me, I could hear chaos unfolding, but I refused to turn. The porter, meanwhile, ran in the opposite direction, equally fast. And in that confusion, he managed to escape with my bundles. What became of him afterward, I cannot say, for I never saw him again. As for me, my escape did not last long. A swarm of those human-like vermin, those men creatures from the beast's back, had already reached the shore in small boats. They pursued me relentlessly, and before I could gain any real distance, they overtook me. I was seized, bound hand and foot, and carried back toward the monstrous sea creature. Soon after, I was taken aboard, and the beast, without delay, turned back toward the open ocean. It carried us away from land, deep into the sea. At that moment, I felt a profound regret, a bitter clarity. I had abandoned comfort, stability, safety for this, and now there was no undoing it. But regret, as I quickly learned, serves no practical purpose. So I adapted. I made the best of my situation, and I turned my attention toward survival. Among the beings aboard, there was one in particular, the creature who carried the trumpet, the one who seemed to command the others. I focused on gaining his favor. Carefully, patiently, and over time I succeeded. Within days, he began to show me signs of approval. Small gestures at first, then greater trust. Eventually, he went so far as to instruct me in what he called their language, rudimentary at first, difficult, unnatural, but enough to communicate, enough to understand, and in time, enough for me to express something important, my desire, my overwhelming desire to see the world. Washish, squashish, squeak, Sinbad. Hey, diddle, diddle, grunt and grumble. Hiss, fiss, whisses. So said the creature to me one day after dinner. But I must beg your majesty's pardon, for I have forgotten one important detail. You are not familiar with the dialect of the Cockneys. That is what these man-animals were called. And as I understand it, the name comes from the fact that their language forms a kind of bridge, a connecting link between the speech of horses and that of roosters. Now, if it please your majesty, I will translate. What he was really saying was this: my dear Sinbad, I am pleased to see you are, in fact, a most agreeable fellow. We are presently engaged in something called circumnavigating the globe. And since you express such a strong desire to see the world, I will stretch my authority slightly and grant you passage upon the back of the beast. At this point in the Isitsorna, Scheherazade had reached this portion of the tale when the king shifted his position. He turned from his left side to his right and remarked, "It is, in truth, quite remarkable, my dear queen, that you have never mentioned these additional adventures of Sinbad before. I find them highly strange and exceedingly entertaining." And so, having expressed this royal approval, Scheherazade continued her narration without interruption. Once again, taking up the thread of Sinbad's extraordinary journey, Sinbad continued his narrative in this manner. I thanked the man-animal for its kindness, and soon found myself quite at ease upon the back of the beast. It moved, as I have already described, at an astonishing speed across the ocean. Although he added there is one strange thing about that part of the world. The surface of the sea is not flat, not at all. It is rounded, like a pomegranate, so that we were constantly traveling either upward or downward, as if the ocean itself were a series of endless slopes. At this point, the king interrupted. That, he said, I find somewhat singular. Scheherazade replied without hesitation. Nevertheless, it is quite true. I have my doubts, said the king, but continue, if you please. I shall, she answered. And so Sinbad went on. The beast carried us onward with the same tremendous speed, until at last we reached an island vast in size hundreds of miles in circumference, and yet it had not always been land. According to Sinbad, it had been constructed in the middle of the sea by a colony of small creatures resembling caterpillars. At this point, the king emitted a short sound. Scheherazade, however, did not acknowledge it. She simply continued. Leaving that island behind, Sinbad described their next destination. Another island, but this one was even stranger. Its forests were not made of wood at all. They were made entirely of stone. Solid, hard, unyielding. So rigid, in fact, that the finest axes, carefully tempered and expertly forged, were shattered the moment they struck the trees. No cutting was possible, no progress could be made. Only destruction of the tools themselves, as if the forest refused to be altered in any way by human effort, and so the journey continued, deeper into a world that seemed less like nature and more like something deliberately constructed to resist understanding. Said the king again. But Scheherazade paid him no attention whatsoever and continued the story in the voice of Sinbad. Passing beyond this last island, Sinbad went on, we reached a land where there was a cave that extended 30 or 40 miles into the very interior of the earth. Inside this vast cavern, there were palaces, not a few, but more than could be counted. More, Sinbad claimed, than exist in all of Damascus and Baghdad combined. And these were no ordinary structures. From their ceilings hung immense formations of gems, like diamonds, but larger than human beings. Within and between them stretched entire streets filled with towers, pyramids, and temples on a colossal scale. And flowing through these cities were rivers, immense rivers, but not of water. They were black as ebony and filled with blind fish that moved through them without eyes. At this point, the king made another sound. Again. Scheherazade did not pause. Sinbad continued. We then passed into another region of the sea, he said, where we encountered a towering mountain rising directly from the water. From its sides poured streams of molten metal. Some of these rivers, he claimed, were 12 miles wide and 60 miles long, and from a vast opening at its peak, there erupted an endless column of ash, so dense, so immense, that it blotted out the sun entirely. Day became night, and not an ordinary night, but something deeper, heavier, and more absolute than darkness. Even at a distance of 150 miles, Sinbad said, visibility was gone. No object could be seen, not even something held directly before the eyes. And so the voyage continued, deeper into a world where scale itself no longer behaved like anything familiar, and where nature seemed to dissolve into something far more extreme and far less predictable. Hum, said the king, and Sinbad continued, as Scheherazade delivered the tale without interruption. After leaving that coast, he said, the beast kept on its journey until we came upon a land where everything appeared reversed. Here, Sinbad described something truly strange, a great lake. But what made it remarkable was not its surface, but what lay beneath it, more than 100 feet below the water. There was a forest, not submerged in ruin or decay, but growing, fully alive, tall trees flourishing in complete leaf, as though the bottom of the lake were its own sky. At this point, the king emitted a sound. Who? Still, Scheherazade did not pause. A short distance farther, Sinbad continued. They encountered a region where the atmosphere itself had changed. The air was so dense, so altered in its properties, that it could support iron and steel, just as easily as their own air supports feathers. The king responded again, fiddle-de-dee, but the narrative moved on regardless. Further still, they reached what Sinbad described as the most magnificent region he had ever witnessed. A river stretched through it for thousands of miles, immense in scale, almost beyond comprehension. Its waters were of extraordinary depth, and clearer than amber, yet richer in tone and presence. Between 3 and 6 miles wide, it flowed steadily onward. On either side rose towering banks, 1,200 feet high, clothed in perpetual bloom. Trees that never ceased flowering, flowers that never faded. The entire region formed a continuous, living garden, endless in its beauty, overwhelming in its richness. And yet, despite all this splendor, there was one name attached to it, a name that changed everything. It was called the Kingdom of Horror. An entry into it, Sinbad warned, meant certain death. Humph, said the king. But Scheherazade continued, and Sinbad's account moved on without pause. We left that kingdom in great haste, he said, and after several days of travel, we arrived in another region entirely different from anything we had yet seen. There they encountered creatures of an alarming kind, vast animals, each bearing on its head horns shaped like scythes, sharp, curved, terrible in appearance. These beasts behaved with a calculated cruelty. They dug enormous funnel-shaped pits into the earth, deep traps, carefully formed. Then they lined the walls of these pits with stones arranged in such a way that, when any other animal stepped upon them, the structure collapsed instantly. The prey would fall straight into the depths below, and there it would be consumed, its blood drained immediately, its remains cast out afterward with utter disregard, flung far from what Sinbad called the caverns of death. At this point, the king made another sound. Pooh! Still, the narration continued. Moving onward, Sinbad described yet another district. And here, the natural order itself seemed distorted. Vegetation grew without soil, plants suspended in the air, as though the ground beneath them was unnecessary. Other plants emerged not from earth, but from other plants. Some derived their substance from living animals themselves. And then there were those that burned with a constant inner fire, glowing steadily as if alive with contained heat. Even more strangely, there were plants that moved, not swayed by wind, but actively relocating from place to place at will. But the most unsettling of all were the flowers. These were not passive ornaments of nature. They lived, they breathed, they moved their limbs. And according to Sinbad, they possess something far more disturbing, a desire, the same detestable inclination found in mankind, the impulse to dominate, to enslave, to confine other creatures in isolated, miserable prisons, forcing them to labor until some imposed task was complete, a world of living things, acting with intent, hierarchy, and cruelty, as though nature itself had adopted the worst habits of human society. Shaw, said the king. But Scheherazade continued without hesitation, and Sinbad's tale rolled forward once more. Quitting that land, he said, we soon arrived at another, a most extraordinary empire. In this place, even nature seemed to have been instructed. Bees and birds were mathematicians, not merely clever creatures, but beings of such intellectual refinement that they provided daily instruction in geometry to the wise men of the empire. And when the king of that land offered a reward for the solution of two very difficult problems, something remarkable occurred. Both problems were solved immediately, one by the bees, the other by the birds. However, the king, for reasons unknown, chose to keep their solution secret. As a result, the human mathematicians were forced into years of laborious study. They wrote countless volumes, endlessly complex books filled with calculations and theories. Only after a long series of years of intense research did they finally arrive at the very same answers that had originally been given on the spot by the bees and the birds. At this point, the king could not restrain himself. Oh my, he said. Still, Scheherazade continued. No pause, no acknowledgement. Sinbad's account moved onward. We had scarcely left that empire, he said, when we came upon another region entirely, and here, the sky itself seemed to move. A vast flock of birds appeared overhead. Not a few, not hundreds, but an immense formation stretching a mile in width and 240 miles in length. They passed above in a continuous stream. Although they flew at the rate of a mile per minute, it still required 4 full hours for the entire flock to pass. Within that single formation, Sinbad estimated, there were millions upon millions of birds, an aerial population so vast, it reduced ordinary scale to something almost meaningless. And so the journey continued through a world where intelligence, motion, and magnitude all existed on a level far beyond anything familiar, and where each new horizon seemed determined to outdo the last in sheer impossibility. "O fie," said the king. But Scheherazade did not pause, and Sinbad continued his account. No sooner had we escaped from those birds, he said, than we were thrown into yet another terror. This time, a creature unlike any they had seen before, far larger than the R.O. birds of his earlier voyages, and so vast that Sinbad compared it to the greatest domes of the Caliph Seraglio. It was, in every sense, immense, and yet strangely incomplete. It appeared to have no head at all, only a body, an enormous rounded mass, shaped almost entirely like a vast belly. Its surface was smooth, soft in appearance, and strangely polished, shining and banded with multiple colors, as if nature itself had painted it. And within its massive claws, it carried something else, a house, not merely a structure, but an entire dwelling torn from its foundations. The roof had been stripped away, and inside, they could clearly see people. Human beings, still within the rooms, still inside the structure, but visibly trapped in a state of panic and despair. Their fate was unmistakable. They were being carried away, upward into the sky. Sinbad and his companions cried out with all their strength. They hoped desperately that their voices might startle the creature into releasing its prey, but the response was minimal. The beast merely emitted a deep snort, a violent puff of air, almost like an expression of irritation, and then it released something else, a heavy sack. It fell from above, striking the ground near them with force. When they examined it, they discovered it was filled entirely with sand. A crude, almost indifferent response, as if the creature had acknowledged their presence and dismissed it entirely. Stuff, said the king. But Scheherazade, without acknowledging the interruption, continued the narrative in Sinbad's voice. It was shortly after this, he said, that we encountered a continent of truly immense size and of extraordinary solidity. And yet, despite its magnitude, it was not supported by land, nor by rock, nor by anything visible at all. Instead, it rested entirely upon the back of a sky-blue cow, a cow of impossible proportions, bearing no fewer than 400 horns. At this point, the king interjected again. That, he said, I can believe. I have read of something similar before. Scheherazade proceeded without pause. We passed directly beneath this continent, Sinbad continued, swimming between the legs of the cow. And after several hours of travel, they emerged into a remarkable country. Here, Sinbad learned something unexpected. The man animals he had encountered were, in fact, natives of this land. This realization altered his entire perception. He began to reconsider his earlier assumptions. Even his former contempt now seemed misplaced, for he now understood these beings to be a nation of powerful magicians, creatures whose minds, according to Sinbad, contain forms, living within the brain itself. And these writhing, restless presences, he believed, served a strange purpose. Constant irritation, constant stimulation, driving imagination into extreme and unnatural activity, producing, in effect, what appeared to be miraculous invention. Among these magicians, Sinbad observed a number of domesticated creatures of unusual form. One in particular stood out, a vast horse, but not a natural one. Its bones were made of iron, its blood, boiling water instead of feeding on grain. It consumed black stones, and yet, despite such an impossible diet, it possessed extraordinary strength and speed. So great, Sinbad claimed, that it could pull a load heavier than the largest temple in the city and move faster than most birds in flight. A being of engineered contradiction, powerful beyond natural explanation, and yet entirely obedient to the strange laws of this world. Twaddle, said the king. But Scheherazade continued without hesitation, and Sinbad's narrative moved forward once more. Among this extraordinary people, he said, there appeared yet another creature of astonishing form, a hen, but not as any hen known to ordinary experience. It had no feathers, and yet it was larger than a camel. Its structure was not biological in the usual sense. Instead, it was composed of iron and brick. Its blood, like that of the iron horse, was boiling water. And like that same mechanical creature, it consumed neither grain nor flesh. Its sustenance was wood and black stones. But its most astonishing feature was its reproduction. This immense construct produced 100 offspring in a single day. And even more strangely, those young remained for several weeks after birth within the body of their mother. At this point, the king interjected again. Falal, he said. Scheherazade continued. Sinbad went on to describe further wonders among these magicians. One of them, he said, created a man, not born, but constructed, made from brass, wood, and leather. This artificial being was endowed with remarkable intelligence, so much so that it could defeat all of mankind at chess, with the sole exception, Sinbad noted, of the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. Another magician built a similar creation, but this one surpassed even its maker. Its reasoning ability was so advanced that it could perform complex calculations in a single second, calculations that would require the collective effort of 50,000 human beings working for an entire year. And yet another creation, far more extraordinary still, was neither man nor beast. It was something else entirely. Its brain was described as a mixture of lead and a dark pitch-like substance. Its fingers moved with incredible speed and precision, so fast that it could produce 20,000 copies of the Quran in a single hour, each copy perfectly accurate, no variation, not even the width of a single hair. This entity possessed immense power, so great, Sinbad claimed, that it could raise or destroy empires with a single action, and yet its influence was not fixed. It could be used for both destruction and creation, for harm and for benefit, a force of intelligence and power, without a fixed moral direction, entirely dependent on the will of those who controlled it. Ridiculous, said the king. But Scheherazade continued, and Sinbad's account pressed on without interruption. Among this extraordinary nation of necromancers, he said, there were beings of even stranger abilities. One individual, he reported, was said to carry within him the blood of salamanders. So great was his affinity with fire that he would sit comfortably inside a red-hot oven, calmly smoking his chibouque, while his dinner roasted naturally upon the oven floor. Another possessed the ability to transform ordinary metals into gold, and what made it more remarkable was that he did so without even needing to observe the process. A third had such extraordinary precision of touch that he could produce a wire so fine it became completely invisible, and another had perception so refined that he could track and count every single motion of an elastic object, even while it vibrated back and forth at the astonishing rate of 900 million movements per second. At this point, the king broke in again. Absurd, he said. Scheherazade did not acknowledge the remark. Sinbad continued. Another of these magicians, he said, could make the corpses of his acquaintances move at will. Through an unseen fluid, he could cause them to rise, to gesture, to fight, even to dance. Another had developed his voice to such an extent that he could make it heard from one end of the world to the other. Another possessed an arm so extended in capability that he could sit in Damascus and write a letter delivered in Baghdad, or any distance whatsoever. Another commanded lightning itself, and when it came to him from the sky, it did not strike in violence, but behaved like a controlled instrument, even a form of entertainment. Another could take two sounds and produce silence from them. Another could take two brilliant lights and create darkness. Another could generate ice, even within a red-hot furnace. Another instructed the sun to produce his portrait, and the sun complied. Another measured the sun, moon, and planets with extreme precision, weighed them, examined their composition, and determined the very substance of which they were made. And finally, Sinbad concluded, the entire nation was so advanced in its necromantic ability that not only its scholars, but even its infants and its most ordinary animals could perceive things that did not exist at all, or things that had not existed for 20 million years before the nation itself came into being, as though reality and illusion were equally accessible to their perception. Preposterous, said the king. But Scheherazade continued undisturbed as Sinbad's account pressed on, despite the constant interruptions from her husband. The wives and daughters of these magi, she went on, are, without exception, accomplished and refined. She paused only slightly, then continued. They would, in fact, be entirely perfect in beauty and interest, were it not for a peculiar misfortune that affects them all. A misfortune, she explained, caused not by illness or injury, but by a crotchet. At this point, the king interrupted again. A what? He demanded. A crotchet, she replied calmly, and Sinbad's narrative continued through her voice. One of the malicious spirits that perpetually seeks to disturb mankind had implanted a strange belief in the minds of these women, a belief concerning beauty. They had come to the conclusion that physical perfection was located entirely in one specific anatomical region, a region not far below the lower back. And according to this doctrine, the greater the prominence of that area, the greater the beauty. Beauty itself, they insisted, increased directly in proportion to the size of this feature. As a result, and aided by the abundance of inexpensive padding in that country, it had become impossible, Sinbad observed, to distinguish a woman from a dromedary. At this point, the king abruptly stopped her. Enough, he said. I cannot endure this, and I will not. Your tales are nonsense, and they have given me a headache. The first light of dawn was now visible, and the king, noticing it, grew uneasy. How long have we been married? He asked. My conscience is troubling me again. Then, after a pause, he added, and that remark about the dromedary. Do you take me for a fool? He rose and declared quite plainly, on the whole, you might as well prepare yourself to be strangled. According to the Isits Harnat, Scheherazade was both distressed and surprised by this response. But she was not without composure, for she knew the king to be a man of strict principle and unlikely to break his word once given. And so she accepted her fate with dignity. Even as the bowstring was drawn tight, she found a final consolation in thought. Much of her story, after all, remained untold, and in the king's impatience, she saw not only her own end, but the loss of countless further adventures that would now never reach the world at all.